Top of the morning and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Looming Macaulay. The headlines. Kremlin predicts US and Europe will grow tired of Ukraine conflict. EU's Borrell proposes new £5 billion aid to Ukraine. Kyiv urges faster legal work on Russian assets transfer. Plus, Ukraine receives first refurbished Leopard tanks from Poland. Thank you for joining us this morning. The Kremlin believes that fatigue with the Ukraine conflict will grow in the United States and Europe, but Washington will continue to be directly involved in the conflict. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov was commenting on a U.S. Congress decision to pass a stopgap funding bill that omitted aid for Kyiv. Peskov said Russia forecast that war fatigue in the West would lead to what he calls a fragmentation of opinion on the Ukraine conflict. Meanwhile, European Union foreign ministers held their first ever meeting outside the bloc as they met in Kyiv in a show of support for Ukraine. The meeting came after a pro-Russian candidate won Slovakia's election on October the 1st. Ukraine's foreign minister Dmytro Kuleba said he was proud to host the meeting and suggested his country will join the 27-member bloc at some point in the future. Mr. Kuleba was joined by EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell and the bloc's national ministers to pay tribute to fallen Ukrainian soldiers before convening for their roundtable meeting. Slovakia's pro-Russian former Prime Minister Robert Fico, whose election campaign condemned even a single round of ammunition from Slovakia's reserves being sent to Ukraine, won the most votes on Sunday and will get a first chance to form a government. Meanwhile, the United States insists its firm military and political support for Ukraine has not wavered, despite Congress having excluded Ukraine funds from an emergency spending deal reached at the weekend to avert a government shutdown. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba insists that Washington's support for Kyiv is not weakening and played down the significance of the stopgap funding bill passed by U.S. Congress that omitted aid to Ukraine. U.S. and other Western military assistance has been vital for Ukraine to fight against full-scale invasion launched by Russia in February 2022. Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba said Kyiv was in talks with Republicans and Democrats in the U.S. Congress, and that the drama around the stopgap bill that averted a government shutdown on Saturday was an incident rather than one that is systemic.
We have a very in-depth discussion with both parts of the Congress, Republicans and Democrats, and against the background of a potential shutdown in the United States, the decision was taken as it was. But we are now working with both sides of the Congress to make sure that it does not repeat again under any circumstances. So we don't feel that the US support has been shattered, because the United States understands that what is at stake in Ukraine is much bigger than just Ukraine. It's about the stability and predictability of the world. And therefore, I believe that we will be able to find necessary solutions. This is a historic event because for the first time ever, Foreign Affairs Council is going to sit down outside of its current borders, of the borders of the European Union, but within future borders of the European Union. And this is a message in itself, a message of support, unflattered support that the European Union is extending to Ukraine, which we are very much grateful for.
We will study the peace plan formula, Zelensky plan formula, order to gather more support around the world and prepare the next one. All my colleagues come here near the metro with the will to show, express through their commitment and the commitment of the European Union to continue supporting you in front of the war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine.
European Union Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell has revealed that he proposed a new bilateral, multi-annual envelope of the European Peace Facility of up to €5 billion to Ukraine for the next year. He was speaking at a joint press briefing in Kyiv alongside Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba. Mr. Borrell told the news briefing that EU remains united in its support for Ukraine. Mr. Kuleba, on his part, called for more clarity on the judicial aspects of how to transfer Russian assets.
I propose a new bilateral multi-annual envelope under the European Peace Facility of up to 5 billion for the next year in singular, more will come. And I hope that we can reach an agreement before the end of the year. The strongest security commitments that we can give to Ukraine is European Union membership. The only one that attracts the attention and the work of the international community is President Zelensky's peace formula. It is, if I can say, the only game in town. It is the formula. Our resolve to support the fight of freedom and independence of Ukraine is firm and will continue.
A Ukrainian victory in its war with Russia depends on cooperation with the European Union. This was President Volodymyr Zelensky's submission to EU foreign ministers gathered in Kyiv on Monday. Mr. Zelensky underscored the importance of defense support for Ukraine after the U.S. Congress left Ukraine war aid out of a spending bill, and a party whose leader said he would end military supplies from army storage to Ukraine won an election in Slovakia. Ukraine hopes to meet a series of EU criteria for joining the bloc and has relied heavily on Western military alliance since Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock foresees a Ukraine that will soon be a member of the European Union. As she met with her counterpart from the bloc's 27 member states in Kyiv, Ms. Baerbock says Ukraine's future lies in the European Union, and the EU community will soon stretch from Lisbon to Luhansk. Baerbock says necessary reform to enable Ukraine to join the EU were openly discussed in Kyiv, including changes to the judiciary and media legislation and measures to fight corruption. With winter fast approaching, she also called for support for a winter protection shield consisting of air defense, protection of critical infrastructure, and generators to help Ukraine through the colder months. A humanitarian fund has been demining, that is demining, farm fields in Ukraine's eastern Kharkiv region, a few kilometers from the Russian border, as farmers all over the country started sowing winter wheat. The charitable fund Demining of Ukraine used a large agricultural drone carrying a metal detector to detect mines in fields owned by Agro-Invest near Derhachi. A geophysicist at Ukraine's Academy of Sciences and a demining volunteer, Ivan Polyachenko, posted that their metal detector could detect iron-containing objects even up to half a meter underground, and that a drone detected mines faster than sappers with the usual detecting equipment. He added that it was a first for his fund that sappers immediately retrieved the mines after they were detected, considerably shortening the time span of the demining process. The head of the sappers unit, Jan Artyukov, explained that the fund's goal is to develop a fast and reliable demining algorithm with drones and sappers. He added they had partially tested it with demining fields in the southern Mykolaiv region earlier this year. Ukraine has received the first batch of refurbished Leopard tanks from Poland. That's according to a Polish industrial partner, who also confirmed that they are working on repairing another batch of tanks for Ukraine. In April 2023, Germany, Poland, and Ukraine signed an agreement to set up a hub in Poland to repair Leopard 2 battle tanks used in Ukraine to fight against Russian forces. The hub was supposed to start its operations at the end of May, according to Germany's Defense Minister, Boris Pistorius. We now speak to security expert, Mr. Chidinwonu, who speaks to us virtually from London in the UK. Good morning and welcome to the program.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
It's good to have you. Now, let's begin in the United States, where have they just postponed the evil day? That is, the U.S. Congress, for those in support of aid to Ukraine. With this $6 billion they couldn't get passed in this temporary spending bill, it's only up till November the 17th, and then they have to start the process all over again. Is this a sign of things to come?
Well, the funding issues with the United States are a recurring decimal. It happens every single year. They have this shutdown battle. If it's not over one thing, it's the other. It's either going to be about the border or it's going to be about taxation. There is always some issue that they pick that is going to be the final issue that without any agreement, the entire U.S. budget will collapse. It's constant, it's consistent with U.S. politics. So it's not unusual in that respect. Obviously, there is a U.S. Kind of political dictum that politics ends at the water's edge. In other words, there is bipartisan support for any foreign policy that the U.S. has. That's generally, you would say, in the 80s and 90s was the U.S. position. This has gone now ever since the whole culture wars of the Trump-Bush era. That dictum no longer applies. So foreign policy is fair game. And as you've seen with this, Ukraine, the Russian war against Ukraine is key fodder for many Republicans in the U.S. So what this means essentially is that President Biden has to find a new mechanism to fund Ukraine. The Republicans can't afford to have a shutdown on their watch, and particularly a shutdown over Ukraine, which is to most Americans a non-issue. So there will be an agreement, and they will continue kicking a can down the road, which they've done for years. Most likely, at some point, Biden will have to strip out and have a separate bill, and then there'll be a big almighty fight over that. But the Democrats will most likely get through because they have a very slim number of supporters in the House of Representatives, but they've also got several Republicans who support the Ukrainian stance. So they'll most likely get it through. But it just means in the general, and when you link it to many other things happening, as you mentioned about the Slovakian election and the issues in Hungary and the issues in Poland, it just creates that little bit of a kind of a feeling of fear amongst those who are maybe supporting Ukraine, that lockstep Western support, its fragility is becoming a lot more apparent.
So you're in agreement, therefore, with Dmytro Kuleba, Ukraine's foreign minister, who's played down this incident, calling it a systemic one. But if you listen to the Americans, many people feel very strongly about sending aid to Ukraine while their domestic policy, according to them, is suffering. The $31.4 trillion debt inclusive in the arguments, and the fact that $75 billion in military assistance has already been sent to Ukraine.
Yeah, so I think there's several elements. The first thing I would say is most Americans couldn't tell you where Ukraine was if you literally pointed at it on a map. And I'm not saying that in a disrespectful way to Americans. I'm saying that it doesn't reflect in their daily life. Now, on social media and in the media, it's there's a lot of vocal commentary, but again, a lot of that commentary is not necessarily about Ukraine. It's bound up in domestic American affairs. One of the statements that somebody who is supports maybe the Trump side of life in America said to me is, I'm not sure what's happening on Ukraine, but all the people I don't like seem to like it, so I'm against it, and that's how it works. There's a lot of people who don't really care about the issues. They're just doing it because their side is against it, or they think, or the other side is for it, so they're against it. In terms of, but where it's dangerous is how much Russian narratives are feeding into U.S. politics, and how much Russian narratives are being taken as facts, or not facts, but as given statements by U.S. political actors. And you've got people who are, Trump is a separate issue, but you've got other people who are now pandering to Russian narratives and challenging their own government. Not necessarily, again, not for any logical or geopolitical reason, but purely because they want to use it as a cudgel to beat their government. So yes,
What?
Kuleba is correct in that it is a systemic issue. As I said before, every year America goes through this really ridiculous pantomime and then, eventually gets somewhere. But now it's obviously an issue because it affects American foreign policy, and it has to be something that the Ukrainians in particular will be taken into account. And as we see now, there are many initiatives taking place, some public, some not, to domesticate weapons production in Ukraine, as well as to, certify or to kind of cement those supply lines, particularly from European suppliers.
What are we to make of this win of this far-left Slovakia party and Robert Fico at the helm, a former leader who now has the authority to form a new government, given that he said that he's not going to support any form of military assistance to Ukraine forthwith when he gets into the reins of power?
So Fico is a very interesting conundrum. Now, Slovakia is a very, it's a very interesting country, a very beautiful country. If you ever get to visit there, it's got a really, interesting place with lots of, I like mountains, so it's got really nice mountains. But the most interesting thing about the whole Fico victory is less his victory or his anti-Russian kind of narrative, which is anti-Ukraine narrative, which is important. It goes back to almost exactly what we were saying about the American side of life. The local trumps the international. Why do I say that? Fico was a former prime minister, or former president. That's wrong, prime minister. He's not, somebody who just woke up. He's not maybe a Trump who appeared from nowhere. This guy is an old establishment guy. He's been in politics. So a lot of Slovakians know him. They recognize him. This is a face they've seen before. They know what to expect of him. He's a familiar face in uncertain times. I think that's the first point. The second point is that Slovakia there is a grouping called the Visegrad Four. It's Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic and Poland. These are the Central European powers, former, enclaves of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They call themselves the Visegrad Four. Slovakia has always been the naughty boy of that little group. They were the last to join NATO, the last to join the EU, the last to join the European currency. But curiously, the person who took them into all of this thing was the same guy that has just been elected, Fico. So he's not necessarily, so beyond all of his rhetoric, what we've got to accept is that he's actually a pragmatist. He might be a populist, but he's actually a pragmatist as well, and he understands the benefit of the EU and NATO to Slovakia. Now, when I mentioned Slovakia being a very beautiful country, it's also a very small country with a small population and also extremely vulnerable. It's landlocked, it's mountainous, so it's got good guerrilla kind of country, but it wouldn't last long against the Russian invasion. And I know, from friends there, the mood when the Russians invaded was very, very, very tense. People were really scared, and they've done a lot to help the Ukrainians, during the time. They've provided, aircraft, tanks, self-propelled guns, ammunition. For a population and a country that small, they provided a huge amount. So why, again, do I say that it's local? Well, because there is a grain deal which was struck with the bordering countries of Ukraine. Now, that deal allowed Ukrainian grain to go by land through these neighboring countries, which depressed the market for farmers in those bordering countries. Now, this was just became a straightforward trade dispute. But when you think, as I said, a country as small as Slovakia has given so much aid to Ukraine, a civilian and military population, and then Ukraine took Slovakia and all those other countries to the World Trade Organization court, to fight for this trade deal. That really annoyed people in Slovakia. And that, again, contributed to this. So when we look at this situation, it looks like, again, a grand kind of, Russian domino falling into place. But instead, there's a lot of local elements here, a huge amount of local politics that is filtered into the international. And it happens that it falls into place on the side of Russia. But in reality, it's local issues that are driving these.
The billionaire Elon Musk has been in the news for a number of reasons. I'm sure you saw him recently at the border in the United States to bring attention to what's happening there for the influx of migrants. And we'll be reporting in the course of this program furore from the Ukrainians over his mocking of President Zelensky's assistance for help on X. Is this in retaliation to criticism of the Ukrainians against them not letting, against Musk not permitting them to use his Stargate or Starlink satellites for their war efforts?
I think the Elon Musk situation is interesting, but it's also, again, as I always say, it's maybe, you know, we're looking too much at it. In that you've got a very, very rich man, a very, very intelligent and successful man, with a lot of time on his hands and a lot of influence, who has decided for several reasons, some I think personal, some I think business, to take a particular political position and use his platform to kind of amplify it, which, you know, is not as unusual as we think. You know, if we go back in history, the Spanish-American War was precipitated by the Elon Musk of those days. I think Hearst, or what, I can't remember if that's his name, who turned several minor issues into a huge geopolitical scandal, and then caused the Americans to attack the Spanish, who were very weak at the time, taking Cuba, Philippines, other places. So these rich, powerful men throughout history have always had this kind of a geopolitical effect, because simply they have the ability to do so. In this particular instance, again, we have to take away the noise from the sound, as it were. And the sound is that Starlink is critical to Ukrainian combat operations. It's the ability, it gives them that ability to not only target their weapon systems, to communicate with their troops in the field, and defeat Russian electronic warfare to a great extent, or to some extent, much better than normal radio or telephones would do. So that has continued functioning in Ukraine. It's not even switched off. It doesn't matter what Elon Musk says, it's going on. So the Ukrainians have that. The issues with Crimea, it was explained as, being as a function, actually being the US sanctions have prevented them from using it there. The explanation seems credible to me, but Musk was quite happy to create this narrative of him deliberately, hindering the Ukrainians. He wants to be seen as somebody on that side, as we mentioned at the beginning of the show, that side of the American politics, which looks at Ukraine as a way to, attack the Democrats. And again, going to the border, again, that's a key Republican talking point. So I think Elon Musk has shown clearly where he sits politically, and that he's ready to use his voice, his wealth, whatever it is, to amplify that side of life. So again, in the grand scheme of things, it's nothing unusual in America. I've just given the example of the Spanish-American War. During the Iraq War days, you had what in America, the Koch brothers, who were paying for candidates and campaigns to, against Obama and all of this kind of thing. So it is par for the course in American politics. Musk is different because he's not an American, he's South African, and he's young. He's relatively young. He's a tech guy, so he speaks to a slightly different demographic. But I don't think, again, it's a systemic thing. I don't think this is anything different from what we've seen from the billionaire class in America and their desire to have an impact on world affairs.
Well, finally, do you think that can sway the opinions of people across the world who aren't in touch with the finer points of this conflict? Because, as you mentioned, he's quite young, and because he has his hands in different pies and can influence a lot of generations back and forth, Generation Z to the others farther up. And finally, the Russians say that war weariness will kick in before the war continues for too long. That is on the part of the European nations. And do you think that's a viable opinion?
Yeah, so in answer to the first question, you're correct. Again, I'm going to give my very typical Chidi answer of yes and no, in that Musk will have influence because of who he is. And, as somebody of the other generations or the slightly higher generations, he has influence within my circles. He's seen, as somebody who has, broken through several boundaries, several ceilings. He's quite an influencer, as the young people would say. But again, in some cases, you're talking to people who are baked in. We're not talking to people who are to be swayed one side or the other. I don't think there are people who are on the fence in this issue or trying to find solutions. Everybody kind of knows if you're interested in Ukraine or Russia, you kind of know where you are already. Musk or Matt Gaetz or Biden isn't going to sway you one way or the other. They might maybe motivate you to do more, but they're not going to sway you. Now, so that's the no part. The yes part is, as we saw in the American election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, it only took a little bit of tweaking one way or the other to to change the vote against, Clinton, to press her vote and increase Trump's vote. So that's the power of these influences, is that those little niche areas is where they can have an influence. And somebody like Musk owning a platform like Twitter, which has all the data of its users, it knows the little, triggers that it can push. Just as a personal example, as someone who follows world events, I find that my timeline is bombarded by pro-Russia kind of content now more than anything else. And it's I don't know if that's just from what I look at, but it just seems very curious that all my content seems to come from pro-Russia influences, and ever since Musk took over. But that could just be but what I look at. And then in the final question about war weariness is a little bit. It's not a phrase I would use, because America is not at war. America is just paying for a war that they will never see. In the same way America paid for Afghanistan and Iraq, and it didn't have any effect on them. Politically, it will be turned into an issue, but I think the American support for Ukraine will sustain. The biggest risk, let me rephrase, up until at least November of next year. And once that election is over, I think we will know much better what will happen. But as you can see, nobody's taking anything for granted. And both in Europe and in Ukraine, contingencies are now taking place to ensure that even if American support is withdrawn, Ukraine will continue to fight for its freedom.
Thank you, Mr. Nwanu. You can imagine if Justin Bieber was supporting a certain cause, you can imagine his throng of fans will be looking in the same direction, or Ariana Grande. So it goes beyond sectors and beyond countries. But we thank you for your opinion and your contribution and insight this morning, Mr. Chidi Nwanu, security expert, who joined us from out of London.
Thank you for having me.
After the break, the U.S. says White House in touch with allies over new Ukraine funding. Welcome to the second half of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. A management professor and advocate for corporate social responsibility is surprised at the decision to strip U.S. aid to Ukraine in a stopgap bill, calling it crazy, and saying it could draw American troops into the conflict surrounding Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Sonnenfeld, a management professor at Yale University, is founder of the Chief Executive Leadership Institute. More recently, the institute has focused on corporate social responsibility regarding Ukraine and tracking companies which have scaled back business activity in Russia. Sonnenfeld has hosted Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Ukrainian ambassadors at Yale and recently visited the capital, Kyiv.
It was ridiculously used as a political football. It's completely irrelevant. It's not even, not even 5% of the U.S. defense budget, not even 1% of the federal budget. We spend more money on telling people to slow down on highways a year than this entire funding for Ukraine. It's ludicrous. It's a small amount of money relative to the U.S., not to Ukraine. This was crazy. It's complete surprise. It was just to try to come up with some kind of a give me, so that McCarthy can say he's got some concession from the Democrats. But this shouldn't be a partisan issue. This is, as soon as should Ukraine fall, as Putin has said, he's going after Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. He used to have Finland once too. He'll go after them. Sweden feels imperiled, which is why Sweden and Finland just both joined NATO. This is, of course, Poland is in danger. These are all NATO countries, Moldova. So as soon as they get attacked, then we do have to have soldiers in there. We are committed into our NATO agreement for mutual defense pact. So keeping this in Ukraine, and Ukraine fighting our battle for us, is doing us a big favor. Who needs to trigger World War III? The votes are overwhelmingly there for this. The Senate has voted to put it through, and the House was again in favor of it overwhelmingly. So it will definitely clear. But it's just really bad signaling to do it right now, because this is all Putin has. His military is half destroyed. Nobody thought that was possible. His military is half destroyed. He's losing the military campaign. He has lost the diplomatic war. He's obviously shown himself to be a bloodthirsty tyrant. And economically, he's lost.
Conversely, according to the White House, it has been in touch with allies and partners about continued funding for Ukraine, and those considerations will continue. As according to White House spokesperson Karine Jean-Pierre, Ms. Jean-Pierre reaffirmed the U.S. government's commitment to helping Ukraine defend itself throughout the war with Russia.
Look, let's not forget what the purpose of this is for. There's a bipartisan support, as we have seen from day one, for continued funding, in Ukraine. And look, let's not forget what the purpose of this is for. This is for to see the continuation of the brave people in Ukraine to fight for their freedom, right? To fight for their democracy. And so that's what we want to continue to do. That is what the president wants to continue to see, and not just us. There are Republicans and Democrats in Congress in a bipartisan way who wants to see funding in Ukraine continue. So look, we have been in touch with some of our allies and partners, certainly about Ukraine, and that is something that we have done for some time now, over the past 17, 18 months. And so that's going to continue. The president, as you know, was able to bring more than 50 countries together to show their support for Ukraine. That's our partners and allies. You saw what he was able to do with the NATO alliance. They are the strongest that alliance is the strongest that it's ever been. And so that commitment is going to continue. We've seen bipartisanship on this issue, to continuing the funding for Ukraine. This is, the president said it. The speaker and the overwhelming majority of the Congress have steadfastly supported Ukraine. So there is a bipartisan support for this from the beginning. It's going to continue. We've heard from Republicans and Democrats in Congress, and that's what we expect. What we know is that there's bipartisan support for this deal. Again, Speaker McCarthy was on the air multiple times yesterday saying that he certainly wants to continue support for Ukraine to get the weapons that they need. And so we're going to hold him to that. That is something that he has said. That is a commitment that he has made.
We now bring in experts on international relations theory at LASU, Lagos State University, that is Dr. Dakwa Thomas, who's also a founding member of the Association of Foreign Relations Professionals of Nigeria, speaks to us virtually from the Lagos State University. Thank you for making out the time to be with us. Dr. Thomas, if you can hear me, this idea that support for Ukraine is equated with support for freedom, and disdain for Russia is equated with disdain for dictatorship. Does it hold water for those who want to see the Russian side of the story? In the United States, you heard from that professor and the White House spokesperson. They're made in the shade. It's a done deal. Everyone supports Ukraine. But they couldn't get that bill passed because they could only get it passed because $6 billion was removed from that spending bill. And they're going to vote on it again. Is it a mirage in the United States, as we are being led to believe, that everyone supports Ukraine?
Well, I don't think it's a mirage, kind of. I think every American citizen goes along with the traditional policy of the state to always ensure intervention in issues bordering on human rights and freedom. So I'm yet to see any American that does not align with this particular policy. So it's not a mirage. Yes, once in a while, psychologically, you may be confronted, you may be confronted by the reality of economic issues. And the only reason that they can adduce for now as being responsible for the hardship or for economic downturn is the money being given to Ukraine. It's a psychological thing. They will overcome it because they will, at the end of the day, they will realize that it is more honorable to align with global thinking or global position, which means that the EU, the West generally, should be seen to be supporting and to also be protecting democracy and democracy and freedom. So it's not a mirage. It's something that is a traditional policy. It's a traditional policy. It's a component of Americans' foreign policy, and it gels with everybody. It gels with everybody. What is happening now is just a matter of, in fact, that is what you should call a mirage. That what is happening now is not real. It's not real. Yes, you may be having some polls saying that people don't favor, support, or aid for Ukraine again, but I think it's just a matter of time to fizzle because the reality of U.S. greatness coming from its intervention in issues or on issues like these will definitely have take its toll on them, and they will come to the realization that it is better for them to stay with those who are fighting for freedom and also to fight for Ukraine. And like I hinted the other time, that it is in their own interest to also support Ukraine for two reasons. One, China is waiting on the sideline to see what will happen so that it can also use that as a kind of compass to determine, or a template to determine what it will do towards Taiwan. And then again, the Alaska issue, I raised it on this program the other time. It's very, very germane, it's very, very germane because, like I said, the native Russians are still there, and Putin may use that as an excuse to intervene. The latest report I read was that it's going to come to Alaska territory and then use as an excuse, use the introduction that they want to free Alaska from fascism. So I don't know who is accusing, I don't know who is a fascist now. Is it Putin, is it Russia, or is it US? So the Alaskan thing, the Taiwan issue and everything will definitely make an average American to support Ukraine in this struggle.
If that Alaskan allegation is true, that would be really fantastic. But you just mentioned that countries should align with global thinking. Doesn't aligning with global thinking make you a globalist? And aren't globalists the ones that don't put their country first, but put other issues ahead of their country?
That's why I said that what is happening is a psychological thing. It's a natural thing, but it's a psychological thing. But the reality, the depth of your foreign policy, and then the depth of the greatness, the depth of your country's greatness will also be determined by your interventionist adventurism in global affairs. The reason why US is this popular, and you notice, not only in Africa, even in Asia, even in Europe, whenever anything happens, everybody wants US intervention. So this gives them some clout, and I don't think they will want to jettison, or they will want to play with this kind of clout. It's a clout that makes them to be a global leader. Everybody talks about US and everything. So it's something they have conceived all along, since the 18th century. And it's paying off for them. So I doubt if anybody can take this kind of interventionist adventurism away from US foreign policy. You can see that when Trump was there, he attempted to at least simmer down the tempo. Unfortunately, it could not work, because it was a personal thing. He was just floating because it was not gelling with the real traditional American foreign policy. He tried as much as possible to make friends with Putin, but it didn't work in terms of his foreign policy. It was an isolated personal or individual thing. Yes, you want to be a globalist or you want to be an American. At the end of the day, you still want to let people know much about your country, and you still want to see that your country is regarded and respected when it comes to Committee of Nations. You know, the kind of image, the kind of status that US enjoys in global affairs is something that cannot be compared to any other nation. You know, it's not something anybody can compare with any other nation enjoys. And that's because it's a democratic nation, is the ideal democracy. Yes, they have their own shortcomings, they have their own problems. At the same time, we have come to accept them as the policeman of the world. Nobody made them, but well, their interventions here and there were responsible for this kind of upsurge in U.S. status and image worldwide.
Well, I guess time will tell, therefore, whether war fatigue is setting in some way, shape, or form, as the Kremlin is alleging because of the stopgap funding bill, which all of the other parties are saying there's nothing to see here. Don't worry, it's systemic. You've just mentioned as well that it's a mirage. There is strong support for Ukraine, but we will know in the next few weeks whether that support is as strong as it is being touted to be. This fatigue that is being talked about by the Kremlin, and which obviously they're announcing it means that they're banking on it, that is going to happen, because that is the only thing that will cause the assistance from these countries to Ukraine to wane. This fatigue, what do you think? Go on, please. You can jump in.
Yeah. Is it not the same Kremlin that is saying that the stopgap problem in US concerning funding of Ukraine, it has not affected the war, or it's not going to affect, it's something that is just being played out, like that. And at the same time, they are saying war fatigue is setting in. There is something like that. The US support for Ukraine, I don't think that this funding problem, this issue of 45 days is going to affect. Yes, it's going to affect in terms of military supplies, in terms of funding. I believe that it is not something that we should be worried about as such. Yes, those who are at the war front, the Ukrainians who are at the war front, may get worried about it. Why? Because they want supplies, of ammunition to be flowing. They don't want interruptions, because this one will definitely create some kind of interruptions. However, I can see that EU is bridging the gap, is coming in to ensure that this flow of, the flow of supplies of ammunition keeps coming on, and it's not likely that they will stop. So if the Russians are deluding themselves that they are going to be war weary, I think they are just being delusional. And don't forget, every day I keep seeing the Ukrainians becoming more creative in terms of the drones. The way they play with the drones now. Before they were using the conventional way to look for to deal with the mines. Now they have developed drones to search for the mines, and then to also demine some of the fields. And then again, this kamikaze drone, which the Iranians produced, they have improved on it. And that's why it's so devastating. And they were able to attack the Black Sea Fleet headquarters. So it's making them to be more creative every day, because they have to do something more ingenious. Something more creative to be able to win this war. It's not just in terms of the arms they are collecting from EU or collecting from their allies. It's also about creativity, because to attack Russia, which has advanced defense systems of different ranges and categories, you must be very, very creative. And I think they are doing that. And that is why their allies are impressed. They are impressed with what they are doing. And you can see that immediately this US thing happened, they went to hold their meeting in Kyiv, so that they can show the world that, look, this support is not a fake thing. It's going to be like that. It's going to be sustained. So they like the way the Ukrainians are fighting. It's not easy to fight a major power. It's not easy for the Ukrainians. And what is the number? What is the number? And you can see Putin. It can deploy criminals. It can deploy prisoners. It can deploy, they are talking about putting all the unemployed youth, all the unemployed youth now in the war front. So it's just mobilizing, it's just deploying people without the children of the oligarchs. So they are putting children of the poor, children of, that are of low value that they consider to be of low value to the Russian system. All their own children are not there. And that was what Prigozhin said the other time, that where are the children of all these people? They are just bringing in all the children of other citizens. And so, and in Ukraine, you can't do that because EU is monitoring you and they don't want to see deployment of people who are not committed, who are not, those who are not volunteers. They want people who are going to the war, not conscription. They don't want conscription. They are monitoring. They are doing everything. So you don't conscript people who don't want to go to war. It's their choice.
And it can only help the Ukrainians if the 20 agreements, the agreements with 20 arms manufacturers from the different countries in Europe goes according to plan, and they start to assemble and manufacture arms and ammunition in Ukraine itself. We thank you for the time you spent with us, this morning.
The production of arms is something that is intense. They have never stopped. They keep producing, US too.
Indeed.
Keeps producing. They are helping them. I don't see any kind of slacking situation. They are helping, they are really helping them. They are really helping the Ukrainians. EU generally.
Thank you for your time this morning. Dr. Dakwa Thomas, International Relations Theory expert at Lagos State University.
Thank you for having me, Looming.
When we come back, Ukraine removes Hungarian bank from war sponsors blacklist. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back to the final stretch of today's program. Ukraine has removed the Hungarian bank OTP from its international sponsors of war blacklist after, according to them, the lender made a number of commitments regarding its future plans for the Russian market. In a statement, the Ukrainian National Agency on Corruption Prevention, NACP, said its decision followed discussions that lasted 24 hours for the last few days with the participation of the EU External Action Service. The agency hopes that this decision will lead to Hungary's unblocking of 500 billion euros of vital EU military aid for the Ukrainian people. The bank was added to the blacklist sometime in the spring when officials accused it of continued operations in Russia and recognition of the Moscow-backed breakaway Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics in eastern Ukraine. The Russian Defense Ministry says it destroyed Ukrainian fuel depots and military aircraft in a strike in Dogin-Sevo airfield in Dnipro. There were no immediate reports of casualties in Monday's strike. The strike also destroyed 2 armored combat vehicles, 3 cars, and 2 self-propelled artillery systems, as well as a navigation jamming station, according to a Russian report. Finally, anger has erupted in Ukraine over Elon Musk's social media post mocking President Volodymyr Zelensky's pleas for wartime assistance from the West. The Speaker of Ukraine's parliament, Ruslan Stefanchuk, has lashed out at Musk on X, writing, "The case when Elon Musk tried to conquer space, but something went wrong, and in 5 minutes, an apparent reference to SpaceX failed rocket launch in April." Ukraine's parliament, on its official page on X, also accused Mr. Musk of spreading Russian propaganda, posting its own version of the meme with a picture of Musk and the caption, "When it's been 5 minutes and you haven't spread Russian propaganda." And that's it for today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Thank you for watching, and have a good day.